Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Lily Chang. I serve as the founding director of the Chinese Cultural Center at San Diego State University. And currently, I also serve as the chair of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. Today, we're very happy to present to you the Chang Chinese American Experience and Beyond program. And the program is on 3 generations of leadership in San Diego's early Chinatown. Our speakers are Dede Huang and Susie Cassel. Our discussant is Michael Yi. I'm happy to present to you the moderator of today's program, Dr. Bob Stein, who serves as a member of the board of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, and also he serves as the chair of the Palomar Rehabilitation Hospital, and he is also a current key member of the American Heart Association. Dr. Bob, thank you.
Thank you very much to Lily for her usual fine introductions and presence. I want to mention upcoming events. We have 2 upcoming events in October and November, neither of which I think anyone would want to miss. The first in October is going to be on Sunday evening, not Saturday morning. It's going to be on Sunday evening, October 19th at 7 p.m., but it'll be the same links. And the reason it's Sunday evening at 7 is because we have nuanced, who is the executive from the Museum of Jewish Refugees in Shanghai, speaking to us from Shanghai, and that would be done Sunday morning in Shanghai. And secondly, because it's on a Jewish topic, we're having it out of deference to any Jews who would be religious and not wanting to tune in on Saturday. We're having it on Sunday evening. But the topic is amazing. If you don't know World War II, you had millions of Jewish refugees with nowhere to go. There was a worldwide xenophobic outlook. And in 1938, the Evian Conference was initiated by the United States, and they invited 32 countries to participate in Evian, France. And out of the conference, virtually 0 out of 32 agreed to take in any refugees. And Shanghai and China were never even invited to that conference. And then as the war progressed, Shanghai took in, despite war and despite being occupied by the Japanese, took in 20,000 Jewish refugees and saved their lives. And China is very proud of this, and they're happy to tell the story. And we have, as discussants, several people who have personal stories to tell, including twins who were born in the ghetto, including a woman whose dad was there during the war, a woman I know from San Diego, and we have a third person as well. And then if that weren't enough, in November, back to Saturday morning, we're having a talk called A Lost Weekend, a Love Story. John Lennon, although it lasted more than a weekend, John Lennon and May Pang. And the presenter is none other than May Pang. And John Lennon is the John Lennon from the Beatles. And May Pang, you're going to find out in November, and you need to Google her if you've never heard of her. And you certainly wouldn't want to miss either of these. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Carolyn Chin, who's our ambassador from San Diego State University Chinese Cultural Center, about upcoming events. Carolyn?
Hey, thank you, Dr. Bob. Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Chin. I serve as the program ambassador for the Chinese Culture Center at San Diego State University. I would like to take this time to share with you equally exciting upcoming event hosted at our center. On October 8th, Wednesday, we will be celebrating the Chinese Moon Festival with a sharing of the historical origin of the festival, as well as the actual making of the festival goodie called mooncake. The time is from 10 o'clock to 12. Please come and join us by registering online. We welcome you, your families, and friends to join us. Back to you, Dr. Bob.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And I want to mention upcoming events at the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, and the list is rather long, but wonderful. First of all, we're continuing to have our exhibit on the CBI victory, the China-Burma-India Theater victory, which is a crucial part of our America's success in World War II, our collaboration with the Chinese defeating the Japanese who had occupied large swaths of mainland Asia. And it's a wonderful exhibit, and I encourage everyone to go to it. And then the whole month of October, kids are free with a free project on every Sunday at 1. And then October 4th, we have Mochi Ice Cream Social and Mid-Autumn Moon Festival. And you can look at the website for details. And October 5th in the morning, we're going to have our Asian Pacific Historic District walking tour, and you can sign up online for that. That's always fun. And then October 18th, Ghost Stories in the Garden with Storytellers from San Diego. And we have our email for school visits or group visits. And at this point, we want to thank our PL Charitable Trust and the Shu family. And then at next, we want to turn things over to Kathy G, who is our volunteer, high school volunteer, who is going to help us with guidelines for engagement and taking a picture. And also, she's going to be writing down the questions that you may have. You may put them in the chat box and she'll record them. Otherwise, you can raise your hand at the end and then she'll help us with organizing questions when we're all finished. And then at this point, we'd like you to turn your camera on for the group picture. Kathy?
Yes, so there are three screens. Please turn all your cameras on, and I will let you guys know when I'll be done. And then after, please turn your cameras off when the speakers are giving their presentation. Okay. Please turn your cameras on.
Kathy, I'm getting a message that video cannot be started because it is disabled by the host.
Oh,
And I'm getting it now.
Well, we're not
Whoops.
getting that.
okay, should be okay.
Okay, got it.
That's you.
Okay, let me take this again, and then here, and okay. Thank you guys. I'm good, so you guys can turn your cameras off. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, so if we'll just go back now, and I want to mention quickly a couple of housekeeping things. Number one, to reiterate, I love to reiterate, if you have questions, just write them in the chat box and we'll collate them. Kathy will collate them. And the second is the subtitles. We have, through the magic of AI, the English spoken word converted to Chinese symbols, and everyone says that it's highly accurate unless an English speaker attempts to say something in Chinese, which befuddles the software. And I want to again remind you that this is being brought to you jointly by San Diego Chinese Historical Museum and San Diego State University Chinese Cultural Center. And I want to introduce first Dede Huang, who is a US-born family historian based in Hong Kong in the US, focusing on Chinese American families. And It turns out Quon Main in San Diego from the 1880s is her great uncle. We also have presenting jointly Susie Cassel, who's an award-winning professor of literature and writing at Cal State San Marcos and author of Chinese in America, nominated for the Association of Asian American Studies History Book Award, and a leading scholar on Quon, who produced prodigious diaries, and she's been reviewing them now over quite a bit of time, and she's producing the Quon trilogy, research on San Diego's Chinese missions. And as a discussant, we have none other than Michael Yi, who has been over the years on the board of the Chinese Historical Museum for years and is a public historian and has a master's in history from Cal State San Marcos and is chair of AAPI Public History Working Group, National Council on Public History. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dede and Susie. And so if we could have the first slide. And there we go. So Dede, unmute yourself.
Thanks. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for that introduction. So first off, excuse me, on behalf of Susie and myself, I'd like to thank the Chinese Historical Museum and the Chinese Cultural Center of San Diego State for inviting us to speak. In particular, Lily Chang and Muting Huang, who've been so attentive in making all the arrangements, and also to Bob Stein and Michael E., who are kindly acting as today's moderator and discussant. To get started, I wanted to say a few words about how Susie and I made the decision to explore this topic. We've each spent a lot of time researching the two San Diego gentlemen that you see at the top of the screen, the groundbreaking Quon on the left and my great-great-uncle Quon Main on the right. And we started talking about the ways in which they're both similar and different, including the fact that at different points, and to varying degrees, they were each called Mayor of Chinatown. Next. And we also talked about how often Chinatown histories will mention that so-and-so in LA or Oakland or Pittsburgh was called mayor of Chinatown. Or in Chinese American memoirs, someone will proudly say, my grandfather was mayor of Chinatown, right down to the present day. And often there isn't much further explanation. So now usually this was a term of respect, so I don't want to take anything away from the accomplishments of these figures or of anyone's beloved family member. But it is important to remember that this was a term that originated from outside of Chinese communities, and it can be very reductive. Next slide. For example, we see here that there was even a man of Irish descent in turn of the century New York, turn of the 20th century, who called himself mayor of Chinatown too. What's interesting about Connor is that he led tours of Chinatown. He actually took people to see gambling and opium smoking. And so we see from that that implicit in the notion of mayor is the idea of a kind of tour guide, or you could say an interpreter of a community that was perceived as foreign. And that was at best exotic and entertaining, but at worst separate, unknowable, and maybe even dangerous. Next slide. In these 1930s and 1940s Batman and Dick Tracy images, we see how the term mayor of Chinatown was thrown around so regularly and casually that it became a caricature. Kind of like Charlie Chan in that it was an evolution from the coolie or the pigtailed celestial caricature, and arguably a step up because this mayor character has some power, but it's not necessarily for good reasons. He's somebody strong but thuggish. So in short, Susie and I thought it was worth taking another look at this often unchallenged term of mayor and to really try to unpack what it means and offer what we hope will be vivid portraits of who gets this label and for what reasons. And we'll also be considering whether there were other leaders important to the Chinese community who were missed out by this term because they met Chinese rather than Western criteria for leadership. So we're going to cover about a dozen people, some quite briefly, and I encourage you just to get a sense of the sweep and evolution and variation in their profiles, rather than feeling you need to really remember exactly who was who. We're going to restrict ourselves to San Diego because that's the turf we know best. But we do believe that our approach is one that could be applied to other Chinese American communities. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Susie.
Thank you, Dede, for providing such important background information for us. Let's pause for just a moment to think carefully about how the role of Chinatown mayor differed from the typical American mayor of the time. First, unlike a city mayor, this wasn't a title conferred through democratic election. It was usually an informal title bestowed by local journalists. That's why there could be more than one mayor of Chinatown at any given time. Second, the office was extraordinarily complex because the mayor of Chinatown had to serve two very different communities, as Dede just alluded to. Within Chinatown, he was a jack of all trades, translating not just the English language, but American law, culture, and business practices to help fellow Chinese survive and adapt. In addition, he mediated disputes, some of which extended all the way back to China. Outside of Chinatown, he acted as a cultural ambassador and negotiator with local officials, including mayors, sheriffs, judges, and businessmen. It's important to note that often these conversations took place under hostile conditions. In an era of anti-immigrant sentiment, he was expected to diffuse tensions around everything from noisy Chinese theaters and gambling to the mere perception of Chinese, to use Dede's earlier words, as separate, unknowable, and thus probably dangerous. Finally, unlike an American mayor whose legitimacy came from election to an institutionalized office, the Chinatown mayor's authority was derived from his personal language skills, his networks, and his social and economic success. As you can imagine, this made the role precarious, easily turning him into both a bridge as well as a target. In short, the title, Mayor of Chinatown, was never official. It was symbolic and born from necessity. It was a role that arose out of a need to have someone stand between two very different communities, translating their values, their interests, their grievances to one another in the hopes of mutual survival. This leadership position could be found in small as well as large Chinatowns alike, although over some time, Chinatowns had succession plans where, say, the head of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association might automatically serve in that capacity. And Dede will talk about this in a few minutes. But before we go there, let's see how the title Mayor of Chinatown manifested itself in the Chinatown Dede and I know best, the one in early San Diego. Next slide, please. For those who don't know, Chinese first came to San Diego in the 1860s and built two fishing villages, one on Point Loma and one along the San Diego Bay, about where the convention center now stands. Chinatown, not coincidentally, arose just a few blocks from this downtown fishing village because it served as a base from which to export dried fish and shrimp to San Francisco and then to China. As in most communities, there was an array of standout leaders in this early Chinatown, each of whom could have been dubbed the Mayor of Chinatown. Let's meet just a few. Next slide, please. Dr. Huang was a pioneer entrepreneur. He came to San Diego around 1867, and when abalone, a Chinese delicacy, was found in Baja waters, Dr. Huang is the one who built the very first store in what would become Chinatown. In addition, he personally built 2 of the 16 junks that once made up the Chinese fishing fleet here in San Diego. In some years, he helped to export some 700 tons of dried abalone, what some Chinese referred to as black gold. Chinatown grew up around Dr. Huang's store, and he became a wealthy and influential merchant, translator, and railroad labor recruiter. As a respected leader, he was naturally considered an elder statesman within Chinatown. In fact, Quinn tells us in his diary that Dr. Huang is the one who held Chinatown town hall meetings inside his store when there was a need for community conversations. And yet, history does not remember Dr. Huang as an early San Diego Chinatown leader. Now, if we have the time in the question and answer period, we can talk a little bit more why these contenders didn't become more memorable. Next slide, please. Tom K. was another contender for Chinatown mayor. He was a merchant who managed such large lots of merchandise that he can be characterized as a wholesaler in addition to being a merchant. His real claim to fame, though, is that he leveraged his finances into real estate, and he invested in a large number of properties prior to the 1913 alien land law that would prohibit such Asian ownership. Like the others, he was a well-known translator who sometimes worked in the courts, and at least one journalist and one local historian gave him the title Mayor of Chinatown. Again, Tom K. remains largely unknown to history, just like Dr. Huang. Next slide, please. Mr. C.F. Louis was another contender. He was a merchant, translator, and gangster. He was once described by the San Diego Union as the grand mogul of San Diego highbinders. By 1888, it was widely known that Chinatown businesses faced death or damage unless they paid a tribute. One union report from March of that year warned that every business now has its force of guards, and every Chinese carries a knife. Like Chicago with Louis Manu and New York with Mock Duck, San Diego might have had its own Chinatown mayor figure tied to organized crime. In those larger cities, such leaders were sometimes viewed as protectors of Chinese interests, but just as often, they were seen as corrupt power brokers who bribed local law enforcement to continue running their gambling, prostitution, and opium rings without interference. In San Diego, Louis filled that role. He was an incredibly influential man who split the Chinese community in two. According to Quon, half of Chinatown pledged loyalty to him, while the other half stood firmly opposed. Quon was among the latter. On the slide, you can see a magnifying glass. It spotlights Quon's cane, his walking cane, on the bottom, and just above it, the knife that was hidden inside the cane. Silent testament to the very real fear that Quon felt within his own community because of this gang leader, Mr. C.F. Louis. Like Dr. Huang and Tom K., Louis also doesn't appear in San Diego's leadership legacy. Instead, Quon appears as the consensus figure of early Chinatown mayor. Next slide, please. Quon had all the requisite qualities of Chinatown mayor. He was a merchant, he was a labor broker, an investor, and a translator. But Quon manifested these roles with a bit of flair and with an eye towards performance and public relations. For instance, he didn't just quietly manage his Japanese and Chinese fancy goods store, the name of the whole genre of curio shops at the time. Instead, every year for Chinese New Year, he deliberately and courageously opened his doors and invited the neighborhood inside. Next slide, please. This is an image of one of these Chinese Lunar New Year open houses. He had his wife and his children dress in traditional Chinese attire, and he served tea and Chinese sweets, probably dried fruit or candied nuts, transforming his store into a place for cultural celebration and his family into living ambassadors. He tells us hundreds of American people came each year over the course of a weekend, and he says they felt very much pleased. Next slide, please. In fact, while they visited, Quon would often give these guests a personal momentum, the gift of a beautiful family photo like the one that you see here on the slide. Upon reflection, this was more than just simple hospitality. It was strategic community diplomacy. Chinese at the time were widely vilified as alien and morally suspect, but usually from a distance. By inviting his neighbors into his store and his home, Quon did something radical. He broke down walls and he made the encounters personal. His non-Chinese neighbors became guests who shared in his family and cultural traditions. And the Quins, this family that eventually would have 12 children, emerged as individual people rather than as stereotypes. Next slide, please. Not only did Quon convert to Christianity, but he and his family made a public show of it with strolls to church on Sunday mornings through the middle of downtown San Diego, wearing their Sunday best, as you can see in this photo. Everyone knew where they were going. So they were, in essence, performing against widespread assumptions that some Chinese could assimilate to both American cultural and religious values. And Quon wrote about it. Next slide, please. He left behind 11 diaries and a dictionary that told about his daily life, including a litany of good works. There was the time when a friend needed money, and he gave the man the watch right off of his wrist and told the man to pawn it so he could have the money he needed. Time and again, Quon secured non-Chinese witnesses to sign certificates vouching for Chinese merchants so they could return to America after visiting China. He interpreted legal documents, arranged funerals, called for Western physicians, and served as a jack of all trades for Chinese in the stingery. From his diaries, one thing seems absolutely clear. Quon was the go-to guy if anyone needed a helping hand in Chinatown. Next slide, please. And he was a maximizer when it came to networking. In the back of his diaries, he recorded the names of nearly everyone he met, complete with annotations so he could call on just the right person when the time came. He understood the value of ingratiating himself to the broader community, and he joined the Chamber of Commerce and donated generously to national disasters like the 1906 earthquake relief, local charities, and he even presented his prized pumpkin to City Hall in a gesture of goodwill. And I can only imagine what people thought when they saw that pumpkin sitting there on the desk. He possessed all the standard traits of Chinatown mayors, including merchant, translator, and labor broker. But his large family, his conversion to Christianity, his diary, and his penchant for performativity helped to cement his legacy as the mayor of San Diego's early Chinatown. Next slide, please. You can see this transformation here and the way that he was described in the paper as an Americanized Chinaman who wears American clothes, etc. What's even more interesting is that Quon protected his brand. When the Sun newspaper accused him of trumped up charges, and we can talk about this in the Q&A if we have some time. In this case, they accused him of selling liquor without a license and prostituting the nanny. Quon fought back. He sued the newspaper for defamation. Can you imagine? He sued them. Quon consciously cultivated his good name because he believed it would be in his business interests. It happened that the goodwill and services he provided were exactly the things needed to help dispel anti-Chinese stereotypes and make him a leader within Chinatown. Next slide, please. He didn't stop there. Next slide, please. Even from a young age, Quon regularly brought his two oldest sons with him as he checked on his farms and paid his railroad gangs, clearly grooming George and Thomas to inherit his work. George, the eldest, who you see on the right, went on to run the store, the farms, and the grocery business, while Thomas, there on the left, took charge of restaurants and assumed leadership within Chinatown. Next slide, please. You can see Thomas on the left here being called by a newspaper the mayor of Chinatown in his later years. The pattern extended to the third generation. On the right, you see George's son, Joe, who was sometimes also called the mayor of Chinatown in his own day. In this way, Quon established a lasting legacy of leadership in San Diego that was handed down through generations. I'll turn it over now to Dede to talk about some of the other 20th century contenders for the title of Mayor of San Diego's Chinatown.
Okay, thanks, Susie. Next slide, please. Okay. I'd now like to introduce my great-great-uncle, Quon Main, the gentleman on the left. He was right in between the ages of Ah Quin and Ah Quin's sons, and before those sons came of age, Quon Main did briefly earn himself the title of mayor. He ran a store, Quon Main & Co., named after himself, selling the same kind of fancy goods that Ah Quin sold at one point, Chinese and Japanese handicrafts and homewares. Immigration officials often said that Quon Main & Co. was San Diego's most prosperous Chinese business. If it wasn't, it certainly looked that way to the Westerners who were its main customers. Other such Oriental stores sold to non-Chinese as well, but in San Diego, never with this level of polish and staying power. Indeed, the business would last until the early 1980s, and so ultimately for almost a century. However, I should just note that Quon Main, one of his very first business partners in this venture, was the disreputable C.F. Louis. And it's quite interesting, after just a couple of years, both of them put public notices in the paper saying that they have parted ways. So somehow Quon Main literally dodged that bullet. Next slide, please. Right, so there you see an interior view of the store in the 1920s. Next slide, please. So how did Quon Main do so well? Well, for his first 5 years or so in San Diego before opening the store, he worked mainly as a house servant. And during that time, he jumped right in to adopt the standard playbook. He got involved with the Chinese mission, he learned good English, and he caught the eye of his prominent employers. One of them apparently thought, quote, that Quon Main was entirely too smart. He took him down to his warehouse and had him learn things, unquote. The other employer was Harriet Marston, mother of San Diego's favorite son, George Marston. Both families apparently encouraged Quon Main to go into business for himself and may even have provided some skills training. So I hope the array of pictures will also show his transformation. There was an obvious playbook, but good luck, such as helpful employers, also mattered, and you still had to have the snap to actually follow through with the playbook. So, for example, we see at the top left that Quon Main followed the lead of Ah Quin, who he knew, and supported construction of a Chinese mission dorm. But as far as we know, none of Quon Main's 4 brothers joined the church. Those 4 brothers also all invested in the store, but only Quon Main's name was on the shingle. With his better English, Quon Main inevitably served as a government interpreter, and at the bottom you can see a payroll record. Soon, Quon Main was being touted in a very similar way to Ah Quin as, quote, one of the most intelligent Americanized Chinamen, president of the Chinese Sunday School, a person of wealth. With this profile, Quon Main was inevitably obliged to stump up for a wide range of charitable causes, and his name appears on countless donor lists over the years, sometimes along with other Chinese businesses, but often, as in the example on the right, he is the only Chinese business. And I think it's worth noting that his sense of community obligation would have been driven just as much by traditional Chinese culture as by American small-town values of the time. And there were also, many stories of ways in which the store provided a lot of informal services, from post-restant to drop-in advice bureau. And in his later years, he was remembered by the daughter of the man who ran the customs house as a fine old gentleman who would come every year to their house and bring the kids Christmas presents. So in short, by the time of the center photo, Quon Main had proven himself, and he was finally losing his baby face, and so it would be no surprise if he was looked to by Chinese and non-Chinese as a community leader. Next slide. And in 1915, that's what the press said Quon Main was. Ah Quin had died 2 months before, and Quon Main was credited with rallying the Chinese community to bring a rather spectacular dragon team from Los Angeles. Chinese New Year that year coincided with the launch of San Diego's first expo. And so Quon Main was in essence urging his fellow countrymen to think bigger, to do something splashy for themselves and for the whole town and for the profile of Chinese in the town. But only days after Quon Main is called mayor in the press, another man named Huang, who Susie and I can find no information about, he's also called mayor. And this kind of shows how the tagline could be tossed around quite casually at the discretion of random journalists. So Quon Main stepped up in the moment, but did he play an ongoing role as mayor of Chinatown? As Susie notes, there was no election process to tell us who was in the running or with what qualifications. I would like to argue that despite being brash in his young years and prosperous in his middle years, I believe that in his later years, Quon Main shrank from playing the public role that he might have. And this was because of some major personal tragedies. Next slide. Right around this time, Quon Main lost both his younger brother, the only brother involved in the day-to-day running of the store, and then his wife. By now, the store had become what I like to call Quon boot camp, with many young male relatives and non-relatives helping out and learning the ropes. Without his younger brother, Quon Main really had a lot on his plate. Also, Quon Main's closest nephews, his younger brother's sons, were older than Quon Main's own sons and really showing a flair for the business as salesmen. So Quon Main had succession worries. Would his sons be able to hold their own against their older cousins? Was the pot big enough to go around? Certainly he had done well, but there was a glass ceiling to his success too. And the reason that Quon Main's sons were so young was that his first wife couldn't have kids, and then his second wife, who you see here, had 3 daughters before she had any sons. So back in the day, as his store was just starting to take off, there must have been a moment when young Quon Main had thought that he had a pretty good chance to copy the really unique part of Ah Quin's playbook, the big family, and thus defy the typical lonely guy trap, you could say. But unfortunately, this second wife, sent from China by another one of Quon Main's brothers, she didn't turn out to be a capable partner like Ah Quin's wife, Ah Su. She was, unfortunately, a rather frivolous lady who enjoyed dressing in Western clothes, and family hearsay says this got expensive. So after she had 2 daughters, with so few other Chinese women in San Diego, Quon Main decided that she should go back to the village. The problem was she had been raised as a serving girl in a nice family near Canton and had never lived in the Quon village, and so she never fit in. To cut a long and tragic story short, after she gave Quon Main a 3rd daughter and finally a son, she fell prey to a bad guy, ran off, came back pregnant, and ultimately hanged herself in the Quon house. So now, on top of succession worry, Quon Main was grieving and racked with guilt, and publicly he may also have felt embarrassed. This all happened very close to or soon after Ah Quin's death, and so my impression is that Quon Main stepped back. However, given the reputation of the store and its eventual longevity, I don't think that this is what people today would assume if they were told that Quon Main was a mayor of Chinatown. Also, as it happened, one of Quon Main's boot camp nephews was showing himself to be well-suited, perhaps even better suited than Quon Main, to play a leadership role. So we'll come back to him in a few minutes. Next slide, please. But first, I need to tell you something about some of the larger changes underway in the Chinese community and how it was organizing itself. For quite some time, there were a number of different district associations or mutual aid societies operating in town, but no overarching umbrella association as there had been in San Francisco and other communities for decades. In San Diego, a CCBA was only established or came to the fore relatively late, around 1920. Presumably in response to shifts in the community and its needs. Not least, there was a growing commitment among many of the Chinese to stay in the US and not simply sojourn until their retirement. And there was also a growing number of women and children. By this point, it was 20 years after Quon Main had brought his wife over to the US. This building, which had belonged to another association that faded from the scene, now became the CCBA headquarters. That was in 1920, and it still is today. It's on 3rd Street in the heart of Old Chinatown, And it was a site that was used for a variety of community functions for pretty much as long as there were Chinese in San Diego. Next slide. Okay, so here you see one of the sub-organizations under the CCBA, an association that was just for 4 surname groups, which included the Quon lineage. Longong claimed about 100 members, so roughly a quarter of San Diego's Chinese community. And here you can see 2 World War I servicemen were highly featured to show that ethnic Chinese could be patriotic Americans. Notably, this is just 4 years after Quon Main was called mayor, but he does not appear in this photo. And something else you don't see is later that day, the Longong Association hosted a big banquet attended by many what they called American friends, including sheriffs, a justice, the district attorney, the county assessor, auditor, and the head of immigration, which suggests, considerably more community, cross-community, I would say, interaction than you might expect would have happened back then. So I would like to focus on the man circled in the second row. Next slide. Quan Yi-Wa was a school teacher. In another time and place, he might have been a significant leader. At this time of change, there were finally enough children in San Diego to create demand for a Chinese language school. That was, of course, a very typical need that a community would look to its leaders to provide. We only have this one 1916 photo of that early effort at a school, and Quan Yi-Wa isn't in it, but we know from other records that he was in San Diego working as a teacher not long after. So even if this is not his exact cohort, you can get a good idea of his pupils at that time. And we guess that the Longong Association might have been behind this effort, since they recruited someone from a San Francisco school who was surnamed Quon and from their same home county. Quan Yi-Wa had an impressive 20 years of education. You see him in his robes when he was a student. Two of those 20 years were spent in Canton. In many villages, such a teacher would have had considerable stature as the community's most educated person. In overseas Chinatowns, men with Quan Yi-Wa's level of education were also regularly sent from China to serve as presidents of benevolent associations like the Longong or the CCBA, with local merchants filling the other director roles. So in this way, a scholar could serve as a quasi-diplomat. And moreover, since most merchants in the US had limited education, I'm sure scholars like Quan Yi-Wa were very important for preparing all kinds of documents, coming up with flowery phrases for speeches, perhaps writing the calligraphy for New Year's couplets that would hang, on the temple or other important buildings. So that's just a little bit of a sidebar to consider a Chinese profile of leadership that would have been pretty meaningless or certainly mostly invisible to mainstream American society. Next slide, please. Now I want to introduce that promising nephew of Quon Main's, Quan Chok, who's seen here in the Quon Main's store attic. I call him Quon Main's nephew, but he was in fact the son of a first cousin, not the son of a brother. He was similar in age to Ah Quin's sons, but he was born in China. As one of the first, if not the first, of the second generation working in the Quon store, he became the bookkeeper and someone Quon Main really leaned on when his younger brother died. This photo is not long after that death, and you'll note Chok has a protective or consoling arm around Albert, my grandfather, who was bereft at having lost his father. Next slide, please. Chok came from China at the age of 14, and so he had time to develop the basic toolbox. He was enrolled in one of the church schools and became actively involved in the Chinese mission for many years. The central photo is a mission photo. He learned good English, and with his English, he became an immigration and court interpreter, like many of the others, but not for just a few years or on an ad hoc basis like Quon Main, but as a real 20-year career, with the result that he had warm, friendly relationships with his non-Chinese colleagues. But Chok also had qualities that went beyond the basic playbook. He seems to have been a very warm people person. You saw his arm around Albert. And he had a knack for languages. He spoke not just several Chinese dialects in English, but apparently also 5 European languages. And he was quite media savvy and often got himself or the community covered in the local paper, but not in the kind of pidgin English as happened with Tom Kay and some of the earlier leaders. So interestingly, since he must have known that he wouldn't inherit any part of the Quon main store, which was already, had a lot of potential heirs, he developed a third career as an herbalist, or as he says in his ad there, herbist. As with the Quon main store, his target clientele was Western. And my hunch is that he was successful as a healer, not simply because he just put himself out there with his kind of confident, slightly humorous ads, but also because he was just one of those people who makes other people feel better. Next slide. We know that Quon Chok held the role of English secretary, which was a standard role for the benevolent associations. He was English secretary for Long Gong and a couple of other associations, and it's my guess alone, only a guess from these two photos, that he must have been president of the CCBA at some point. Sometimes that position was just on a rotation. He's shown clearly in the center, and he's obviously not at all shy about standing out in a light-colored suit when everybody else is in dark colors. So in sum, although Chok was never called mayor in the press, I believe that he really was one. Next slide, please. So I'll give one final leadership example, and it involves two leaders, the CCBA and the 1935 Expo. San Diego had two expos in 1915 and 1935, which were major milestones for the city, and I think they make good gauges for understanding the evolution of the Chinese community. And as it happens, that is a topic that our discussant, Michael Yee, has written quite a lot about. Next slide, please. The first expo in 1915 featured a major Chinese pavilion, but it was entirely organized by non-Chinese, and it was called Underground Chinatown. It presented a stereotypical sordid image of opium dens, gambling dens, and as one review said, "It is so much better than the real Chinatown because it has all the gruesome details without any of the dirt." So perhaps that's why Quon Main really made the effort to ensure there was an authentic dragon dance at the time. Next slide. So by this time of the 35 Expo, the CCBA was well established, and so it made sure to really control how the Chinese were presented this time. Sun Mao Hom was then serving as the CCBA's English secretary. He was about Quon Chok's age, but born in the US, and apparently he attended Occidental College. So that's quite unusual at that early time. So he brought on board the other CCBA officers with some of the ideas he had about how they could take better control of the expo. At least two of the top officers of the CCBA then were also surnamed Hom or Tom. And then Sun Mao actively negotiated with the exposition's running committee to let the Chinese community decorate and run the Hall of China. It was a moment of great pride, and his daughters, Gladys and Pearl, and other young women of the community served as greeters. Next slide. But the really proactive and innovative thing that the CCBA did at that time was to tap Sun Mao's son, Ernest, to be the Hall of China's first president. It was one thing to have those young ladies in front-facing but helper-type roles, but really quite another for these elders to give such a young person the big title of president. But Ernest seems to have been quite the golden boy. He was one of the first in his generation to go to college, and at this moment, his college debate team had also won a national award. And I think the fact that Sun Mao had given Ernest the middle name Freeland also says something too. His older brother was called Freeman. So what's clear, I'd say, is that by this time, both the Chinese community and its leadership had clearly evolved. So with that, back to you, Susie.
Thank you, Dede. As you've been listening and thinking more deeply about the role of Chinatown mayor, you may have recognized, as we did, that something is amiss. Next slide, please. There's an inherent paradox in the title Mayor of Chinatown. It names a leader who had no official duties or office, who was chosen without a vote, and who had no institutional power or authority. I called him at the beginning of this talk a symbolic leader, maybe even a shadow leader. But here in San Diego, we're fortunate in that history reveals to us a full circle moment. Roughly 100 years after Chinese fishermen arrived and Dr. Wo Sang opened the first Chinatown store, in 1963, Tom Huang was elected by an overwhelming 87% majority to the San Diego City Council, becoming the first Chinese American elected official in San Diego County. Next slide, please. Just 5 years later, he continued that success by winning a seat in the California State Assembly. And in the 1880s and 90s, he parlayed that formal authority into lasting community impact. After serving as the president of the Gaslamp Quarter Association for about 4 years, Tom, his wife Dorothy, and a number of other Chinese community leaders helped to establish our Asian Pacific Historic District and the very Chinese Historical Society and Museum that is sponsoring this talk today. Importantly, he did so through legal structures of power that were not available to Chinese 100 years ago when Wo Sang and then Quin were considered for the role of the mayor of San Diego's Chinatown. So here in San Diego, the paradox of the Chinatown mayor gets resolved. Next slide, please. After about a dozen informal symbolic leaders, one of our own ascended to elected office, gaining true institutional power. And with that power, Tom Hum moved mountains, helping to create cultural institutions that, in a very real sense, are still bringing us together today. So this is the journey of San Diego's Chinatown leadership as we understand it, and it's not unique. Many disenfranchised communities have had to travel a similar path, from informal authority to formal power. Our hope is that this story inspires further study of Chinese leadership in other cities, near and far. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susie and Dede. I think this concludes the session, I think, and we're going to be calling on Michael soon. And I just wanted to ask a couple questions and make a couple comments. So the idea of an informal mayor is sort of an issue of discrimination and separateness and a different language and so forth and so on. And in 2025, Nick Pecoraro is currently referred to as the mayor of Little Italy in San Diego. And he has a yellow house on India Street. And it's he's sort of a go-to guy. People want to talk to him about the Italian American community, and he's the man. And in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, there's a guy named Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, and he is called the mayor of Crown Heights. And he is the guy that politicians and New York officials who are actually elected and paid visit when they want to ask questions about the Hasidic community in New York to get their votes, the Hasidic bloc, this and that. They, unlike many of these other organizations, aren't interested in assimilating. They're interested in continuing their clothing and language. They speak Yiddish as a primary language. It's all very interesting. So these different communities are throughout the country. Chicago had a guy named Oscar D'Angelo who was called the mayor of Little Italy in Chicago. So these are widespread circumstances, and we would never have known this history regarding our own city of San Diego, Quon, Maine, Quin, and all these others, if it weren't for Dede and Susie today. This is a wonderful session we've had, and I've enjoyed it a lot myself. And right now, I'm going to turn things over to to Michael Yee, who's going to unmute himself and chat about his views on this. He has a master's degree in history from Cal State San Marcos, I think, and is wonderfully versed himself on the history of San Diego. Michael?
Well, thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and I am very so impressed with the research that Professor Cassel and Dede Huang have presented here, and really quite, exciting. I think for my role as discussant today, I really want to highlight some of the things that I know that they have shared. And so I'll have a couple of questions for them, but I also want to leave enough time for the audience to be able to ask questions. So just as a perspective, with history, you can reveal and discover little known facts and people and events. And we've heard, plenty about, Tom K, Dr. Wah Song, Quan Chok, and Sun Mo Han. And then you can also hear about the compelling stories about these individuals and the events surrounding them. And you also heard that here during this presentation. And historians like Ken Burns is, extraordinary at sharing that information to really make for a fascinating picture. And so I'm encouraging you to revisit this video and really be able to relive some of the history that has been revealed. But this also provides a stepping stone for further research. I'd love to know more about each of Dede and Susie's research. But then there's a third element that I really want to explore. And during the preparation for this, they talked about some of these perspectives on the external and internal, I guess, dilemmas and constraints for the title of Mayor of Chinatown. And then they also had explored, and how does this fit in with a national or global picture? So I guess just if I could ask this question, briefly, can you explore a little bit more about what I heard during the rehearsal of how you see this framework, this thoughtful analytical framework expanding to beyond San Diego?
Susie, do you want to say something? Or...
Yeah, I guess it's mostly a local, as I understand it, and from what I've researched, it's really kind of a local endeavor where immigrants who haven't had power, as Dr. Bob was talking about just a minute ago, have had to sort of create a position out of this enormous need. And so it has remained informal. I don't know that it has extended nationally. It did, I think, in the very early days in San Francisco, a Chick and a Singh, those very early CCBA leaders in Chinatown, really did take a national stance and put things in the paper when the anti-exclusion laws were trying to be passed. And they, I think, really did a lot of advocacy on the part of their community. But as far as these smaller Chinatowns that are trickling down the coast, I think these conversations mostly stayed local, allowing the larger Chinatowns like San Francisco, Chicago, New York to take the lead in the national conversation. Dede, do you have anything to add?
I think you've said it well. We'll leave it with that.
All right. So what I'm excited about is, you talk about the local nature of this, but that thinking really, can apply to other smaller Chinatowns, but even for the larger Chinatowns. And so for an academic scholarly approach, and this is one of the things that I think rises to the level of a college level, topic of how were the large Chinatowns dealing with this theme about internal and external struggles and challenges and benefits, and how they were dealing with it's in still a discriminatory society, and yet they were having to use this title for their benefit. It's what they were able to claim and what was given to them, so they took and ran with it. And so I think that whole framework really applies nicely to really almost any Chinatown. And I'd be excited if, what you showed some other leaders of Chinatowns in one of the early slides. And so I think you are setting up that larger scale framework. And I'll be just excited as part of your future research, although I think you have plenty of great research coming, which I hope that you'll talk about, both of you, coming. All right. Well, with that, my second question, to leave enough time for the audience, is in family transitions. And so you talked about some of the leaders, and can you share respectively where you saw some of the families once those leaders, Quinn, Quan Main, then stepped aside or became less visible, who within the family was then taking on power within the family? And I'll focus the question not so much on community leadership, but then who really stepped up within the family. And can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, Michael, you had asked me earlier about Asu's role, and Dede had mentioned that Asu was, just this very capable partner that Aquin had, including someone who mothered 12 children, right? Had a baby almost every year and a half, and took care of them inside the house and ran the store. So she was just an incredibly involved and capable matriarch. And Michael, you had asked me about her leadership. And the gender issues in Chinese American history are profound. And the separation between Asu's legacy and her story and Quin's, in some ways could not be more different. And that's why I'm so focused on writing her story as an example of the story of Chinese women who came to America. But in the household, it was surprising to me to see that, in fact, when Aquin wasn't home at one point, one of the American judges had come over to their house in order to contract some laborers. And Asu was the one who took the call. Aquin wasn't home. So she obviously had enough trust from both the Chinese as well as the American community, and enough communication skills to be able to contract those laborers on behalf of this judge, and in some ways on behalf of her husband. So that was a really nice moment of leadership for her. It didn't go well, and I'll talk about, what happens in the biography for that. There was another incident in the newspaper, and it's in 1911 when Walter Benyon comes to San Diego, and he wants Chinatown to be cleaned up. And Asu is the one who's written about as cleaning up Chinatown, as though she's, sort of the next mayoral figure in Chinatown. The truth in that is that it was kind of an overstatement. She was really cleaning up most of the properties that were her own. So she comes forward as kind of a transitional figure in those ways, but the gender divide really keeps her from being a widely consensual candidate. In addition, the minute Aquin dies, and he dies suddenly, he was hit by a motorcycle in his 60s while crossing the street. Chinatown mourns tremendously, and there's this huge gap in leadership. It's 1914. And Asu is going through the court. She still has a minor child at home. McKinley is only, like 13 or 14. So she still has a host of children at home. She's mourning her husband. And she finds out when she goes through probate that the judge is going to enforce the newly passed 1913 alien land laws. And Asu is not able to inherit the property that was in her husband's name. So she was denied her very livelihood, her very house. And through a number of connections and good legal advice and a few shenanigans, they had to put all the property up for auction. And they worked it out so that her American-born sons could then repurchase all of that property on the auction market. So it was really a profound and sort of incredible moment of Chinese advocacy, and the way that she could come back to repossess legally the property that should have been hers to begin with. So in that leadership vacuum, it was clear that she, really wasn't able to take the reins of Chinatown leadership, in addition to the gaps that existed because of her gender. And so, of course, Thomas and George were then able to move forward, becoming the leaders of the community. Within the family, it was Franklin, I'm sorry, who had gone to college and came back, and he was kind of the scholar in the family. So he was the central hub inside the Quinn family, who helped with all of these properties and really kept the family moving seamlessly through that very dark moment.
Thank you.
Oh, well, Michael, it might be worth adding for people. I don't know if it's entirely clear, but San Diego is really a Tom-dominated town, right? And the surnames Tom and Hom are actually the same surname, different pronunciations of the same Chinese character. Quans were, I guess, quite a big lineage, but not as almighty as the Toms, right? So that's probably why they organized under this four-family association, so they could kind of have three other surnames to ally with to balance out against the Toms. But as I understand it, all or most of the Toms were from the same county, Huipeng, as the Quans, right? So there are probably people in the audience who are descendants of some of these families who actually grew up in San Diego who would know better than me. But in San Francisco, a lot of the infighting among different factions in Chinatown was based on where people were from and so on, and that kind of rivalry. I don't know if that might have been tamped down a bit in San Diego if most people came from Huipeng, or if people then just found other ways to to compete amongst themselves. And then with regard to the Quan main business, I think you had asked me, right, why I didn't mention my grandfather Albert. Why wasn't he considered a mayor of Chinatown? Because he did have kind of a prominent role at the time of the 1935 Expo. The Quan main store had, I think it was 3 outlets on the fairgrounds at the time, and then also supplied a lot of the artifacts that would have been in the Hall of China and so on. And my grandfather Albert, like Ernest and Sun Mao, he had gone to college. He had put himself through USC. He was a real extrovert, very charismatic, and he and my grandmother were quite polished and presentable. So they certainly did their share of sort of hosting dignitaries who came to town for the expo and so on. But although he was playing a significant role in running the store at that time, as I understand it, he had done that rather reluctantly. And actually, he had quite a difficult relationship with Quan Main growing up, and probably mostly because of his father's death when he was so young. So he really wanted to get out of Dodge. So he played a certain role, but he never really held a public title like Ernest, who was president of the Hall of China. So I didn't think it was really appropriate to, he just wasn't sufficiently committed to San Diego to earn that mayor title.
Can I ask you folks a question? Just any of you can respond. Dede, you touched on it.
Mhm.
I want you to expound for just a minute or two on the differences between the 1915 Chinese pavilion and the exposition then with stingery and opium dens and so forth, versus the 1935 exposition, which as I understand it, was a little more favorable to positive qualities of the Chinese American community. Could one of you folks talk about that?
Most everything I know on this subject comes from a paper that Michael has written on it.
Oh, then Michael would be the expert then.
But do you
I'll
want to
be
say something? Yeah.
sir, but I'll do that quickly. And actually, I think there might be an opportunity for other information about this. I would like to then take a quick detour in terms of the API Public History directory, so I can dial that up and then I'll turn that back to you. But this also gives people a chance to get ready for some of the questions. Bob, for your question, the Chinese community was very proud to have the dragon, the 100-foot dragon that was paraded, brought down from Los Angeles. But that underground Chinatown was such a demeaning, degrading exhibit. Charged 10 cents to enter this attraction, and there were wax figures, including, sex slaves and gambling and opium use. So it was really an attraction in the fun zone during 1915 exposition on the grounds of where the parking lot is for the San Diego Zoo. For 1935, very different perspectives. Quon Main was able to have exhibitions. He paid for renovation and exhibit as a full-fledged exhibitor. There was then the Hall of China and the House of Pacific Relations that represented organizations and really were countries around the world. House of Pacific Relations was specifically geared towards peace, not the Pacific Ocean. And so there was a House of Hall of China, a Hall of Germany, Japan, those. And unfortunately, that effort to promote peace did not happen. There was a Chinese Day and a parade from Chinatown up into Balboa Park. And so the respect that the 1935 exposition did was much more honoring the Chinese culture and other cultures of the world. So this is not my talk, but thank you for asking. I would like to switch over really quickly, and then I will turn it back over to you. I do want to promote that, and I'm going to do a screen share, and hopefully this works because I've had some technical issues. And are you seeing this page here, if I may? And if you could display this as a, and if Bob, are you able to see the public
No,
history?
we're not able to see what you want.
All right, here we go.
What we're seeing is your desktop, and there it
Okay.
is. There it is. Okay, we're on.
Okay, so what I want to do is just highlight, this is an effort for the many great public history organizations, Asian American, Pacific Islander. And so I really want to highlight, if you Google this, we are making a working group is trying to just really promote awareness. And so you could see here, there's a public history organization. I will click on that. And so you can see that there's a Google form that has basically collected, we're now close to 40 organizations, and we just really rolled this out. So very happy to see, like the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum is in here. So any of you who are affiliated with an organization, we would love to have you enter your information, and then this could be searched. This is a Google form, but it is restricted and view only. And so also you can't copy and paste information. So it's a little bit more secure. So I will encourage you to enter that. And then I will display this here. Here's this nice little flyer that we are using to promote. So Google NCPH API, and this page will appear, and get your information out and promote it. And then we also have a public historian, but this is also public history professionals. So it includes archivists, consultants, professors, and so get your information on here, and we will have an opportunity to really have some good sharing of information. So thank you for this opportunity to share that. Bob, I'll turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks again, Michael. And as Elizabeth Cheney mentions, if you could put the URL in the chat, that'd be great for other people to look at. So, Michael, do you have any other, there you go, thank you. Do you have any other issues that you'd want to bring up with Dede and Susie for this wonderful talk?
Those were the two main things I really want to highlight their work.
All right, well, thank you again. I am going to turn now to Kathy G and ask her regarding questions and comments from the audience. Kathy, what have you got?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Stein. Our first question is from Alina Yu. She asked, what happened to the Chinese in San Diego after the 1882 anti-Chinese dictionary was passed?
As dictionary, I think she means the Exclusion Act
The
of
Restriction
1880.
I
Act.
think so.
And
Yeah,
so,
if she's here, she can probably speak up.
yeah, but she may have autocorrect have changed it.
Yeah, the dictionary was a automatic
Yeah,
mistake.
it's an autocorrect. It's a darn autocorrect. So
I think very briefly, we could say that Southern California was viewed as a good place to be. There was less sharp anti-Chinese sentiment further south and away from sort of the rough and tumble mining communities and and so on. So that could well be the reason that Quon Main and others came to San Diego area. Do you want to say
if,
something more?
So,
Susie, did you want to
yeah,
comment?
I would say in the big scheme, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act or Restriction Act was really effective in the big scheme. About 300,000 Chinese entered America, and by the turn of the century, only about 100,000 remained. So it's likely that the anti-exclusion law led to something like 2/3 of Chinese leaving America or returning to China and going elsewhere. In San Diego, it's really interesting. Oh, and I would add, right in anticipation of that law being passed, there was a huge spike in entry to California. In 1881 and 1882, before the month the exclusion law was passed, Chinese entrants spiked significantly as a way to try to get in right before the cutoff. But over time, as I said, something like 2/3 of Chinese left California because of all the anti-Chinese hostility. In San Diego, it's interesting that because of the railroad, the population of Chinese actually grew before it decreased. So in about 1890, the transient population in San Diego rose to almost 900, almost 1,000, with people helping to build that railroad up through Temecula after it was damaged by the rains. But like elsewhere, by the turn of the century, the population had significantly diminished. And then it was always only a few hundred, growing after the turn of the century with American-born Chinese.
Thank you. Regarding San Diego, just as a point of history, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act didn't expel anyone from the United States, but it prevented people from coming. And then townspeople, particularly in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington State, took it upon themselves, thinking, well, if the government thinks it's a good idea to exclude Chinese from coming to the country, why don't we expel them all from our towns? And so there were expulsions from towns throughout Northern California of Chinese, and they weren't deported because that was illegal. It was also illegal to expel them, but they had little recourse in the courts, and they would then come to the larger cities. They would come to San Diego, LA, and San Francisco. Arcata is an example in Humboldt County. Katie Bush has written about this, and she gives they have given over the years tours of where Chinatown used to be in Arcata. So I think that sort of answers your question. Kathy, other questions?
Yeah, I think we have a question from Sandri Shah. Do you want to unmute and ask? Okay,
Take
if
a
not, I'll just
stab
read the
at
question.
and yeah, I could just summarize it. I think Sandri asks about the status of merchants. She understands them to have been low status in China. So how was it they went into trading in the West? So I would say that yes, traditionally the higher status was to be a scholar in China, and that was valued. But China had a big and intricate society, and there were a lot of merchants. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had all the fabulous silks and ceramics and all the foods and so on. Also, the people who came to the US and went overseas were from southeast coastal China, right? And China is a very, very big country. So that Chinese in that part of China obviously had their own slightly different traditions. You know probably that they speak Cantonese and other dialects, which are different, and they were always outward looking. So there was a long tradition of Chinese going to Southeast Asia as traders and merchants. And so
I
in this
think we
time
should,
period,
I
when
think we should,
California,
yeah, I
yeah,
think we should also add the point that many Chinese left China out of desperation because they were facing famine and war in China and turmoil. And then when they land in a foreign country, they have no way to become scholars. They can only
yes.
survive by working for others or through trading once they have enough savings, right?
Yes. And
Right.
I'd like to add too that Quinn, for instance, I mean, many of the Chinese who immigrated lived on the Pearl River Delta. So just as Dede's saying, these were trading routes that had generationally been established, even though they were formally against China's, sort of closed policy. These trading routes had long been established. So we had lots and lots of businessmen, a culture of businessmen, in fact, in many of the cities from which Chinese immigrated. Once they came to America, what they found is that having your own small shop or restaurant or laundry had very low entry requirements. They could rent, a facility. They could live in the back room. They didn't have to have a lot of language skills. And these were the kinds of jobs where they could work very, very long hours, but still have some sense of autonomy for their own work. So it's not a surprise that we see kind of an industry for Chinese in restaurants, laundries, and so forth, because again, and small shops, because they could live in the backside, cook their food, raise their children, sort of tend the front side with minimal language skills and have a sense of autonomy. So I think it made sense to become merchants in America. They could also, as our Chinatown mayors did, they could liaise with the local American economy and representatives to bring more tourism and different kinds of economic opportunities into Chinatown. So it worked out well for them.
And also, of course, the actual laundry was off-site, so they didn't have to worry about that. And then it would come back. And in the smaller towns, owning a business was perhaps made you a little bit less likely to be expelled, a la the Arcata experience. So it was also a plus in that regard as well. Um, so, Kathy, what else do we have here from
Yeah,
folks tuning in?
we have a question from Ray Liu asking, did the Tongs play any roles in promoting merchants as mayor? And what about the Tongs in San Diego? There's a question. I think Ray said that his aunt shortly was the mayor of Salinas, California. So you can also see it in the chat, I think.
I guess I would just mention with Alui, Alui and Aquin were at odds. So, Alui had the dark side and people were afraid of him. And Aquin tried very hard to be sort of nonpartisan. His whole his whole agenda was to help everyone he could and to be upstanding and to protect his dignity and his name. So I think even though Alui tried to push against Aquin, Alui disappears from San Diego. And I think, I can't speak totally for Dede, but I think we can't find him after a while. So
Right.
sort of the forces of good overcome the forces of evil in the scenario in early San Diego that I can speak about.
Yeah, I think in general we could see that San Diego was kind of more mild, bourgeois little town, both in terms of anti-Chinese hostility and also uh, Chinese infighting and Tong Wars. So they didn't really have, there weren't any, large battles the way you hear about in San Francisco and New York City, Chinatown.
Thank you. And then I think there's one last question from Sandri asking, were there any connections and communications with the Chinese in the Caribbean, especially during the exclusion period?
I would say probably not any really specific ones. I mean, there may be families often when they traveled from China overseas, they often went to many different locations. So there have been some individual families that had those kind of familial connections. I think that there were CCBAs and the similar kind of organizations in many, many different Chinese communities around the US and around the world because Chinese would sort of organize themselves in a similar kind of way. And I think Sandri also asked earlier, did these Chinese, by getting involved in trade, did that mean they were abandoning Confucianism? So I think at its core, Confucianism is more about values, about how people interpersonal relations within society. And I think you can see that actually these Chinese communities, they still had very much strong emphasis on family, on hierarchy, respect for elders, and a kind of more patriarchal organization. So in those regards, they were just as Confucian as Chinese anywhere else in China.
I would just mention that the Caribbean is kind of a special place when we talk about the overseas diaspora, the overseas Chinese diaspora, because that was the location of the coolie trade, truly the coolie trade, where Chinese were literally contracted and worked on, in terrible conditions in sugarcane fields and things like that. In fact, it was so bad that America passed a law, an anti-coolie law, and it didn't allow any American enterprises to help cooperate in that, in the business of contracting Chinese from China into the Caribbean. There were all kinds of stereotypes and assumptions about Chinese coming here as contracted workers, as coolies. And that actually wasn't the case, but it was the case in the Caribbean. So I think there was a kind of more of a communication blockage between America and the Caribbean in particular because of this law that tried to prohibit American participation in literally a coolie trade at the time.
Well, thank you very much, Susie. I don't know if there are any other questions. Time is moving along, and I certainly want to thank everyone for this wonderful presentation and everyone for tuning in. And a Chinese American experience and beyond wouldn't be complete without my shout out to Lockwood Young from Honolulu, who's tuning in, one of my medical school colleagues from the same era as me. And I want to say hi. And if we could have the slide of upcoming events, Muting, I want to mention these two wonderful sessions coming up. And first of all, next month on a Sunday evening, October 19th, instead of Saturday morning, we're going to have the presentation by an executive from the Museum of Jewish Refugees in Shanghai, telling the story of the only country in the world who took in any sizable number of refugees during World War II. Shanghai and China took in 20,000 European refugees during the war, saving their lives. A remarkable experience and remarkable museum as well. They have a wall with everyone's name on it that's wonderful. I met the director who was visiting here about a month or so ago. And then the following month, we go back to that's going to be Sunday evening at 7. Then the following month, we go back to our Saturday morning session where we have Lost Weekend, which is a metaphor for, I think, an 18-month love story between John Lennon and May Pang of back in the day, presented by none other than May Pang. And so I can't imagine not wanting to hear that as well. These are two wonderful exhibits. And if there are any other comments from the people on the panel, I'd be happy to hear them for about a minute now. Otherwise, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their weekend. And if the participants in this session